As you undoubtedly realize, stress patterns are highly individual. They arise from patterns within our own thoughts and emotions, and if these patterns become habitual, they can become so pressureful that we have little, if any, ability to resist them. Stress for one person is not necessarily stress for another, nor do large problems always bring with them the greater stress. We know that the physical system of man is so constituted that under legitimate stress he receives strong and sudden endocrine strength by secretions in the body which are intended to press energy into areas when these areas are suddenly called upon. Nature tries to help us to keep a reasonable degree of optimism, but nature cannot provide adequately for excessive habit patterns. If the mind and emotions exhaust the natural defense media, ultimately the person no longer receives this support and finds it easier and easier to fall into negative moods. Probably subconsciously, we are more aware of values than we are consciously. Therefore, nature does not support with special energy negative neurotic situations. Nature is telling us that it will not justify or contribute to false emotional or mental stress. It will help us when the emergency is real, but it will not support the nagger or the chronic worrier or the perpetual fault finder. Thus the person again has a certain censorship arising from natural function itself. And if we are consistent with nature and natural law, we will have a measure of security when real need arises. We cannot be rewarded, however, for just making mistakes. One of the basic principles behind nearly all stress situations is the retention factor. Retention is largely the inability of the person to let go. Most problems can be helped by a release process. This is particularly true on the level of memory. If we are willing to let go of negative thoughts, if we simply fail to sustain them by direct conscious effort, they will have a tendency to weaken. We know, for example, in hypnotic regression work, that the individual's memory or awareness of significant episodes or retained episodes will be greater than his retention of areas where little or nothing seemed important to him. Thus, the depth of the groove that is cut in memory by a circumstance largely depends upon how we have accepted that circumstance and the degree of importance that we have bestowed upon it. Thus, we have a conscious problem continuously of trying to determine what is important. And to be important, a memory must be basically good. Negative thoughts and emotions cannot be regarded as truly important. They become so if we think about them enough, worry about them, and pity ourselves, or use them as methods of evading personal responsibility. We can make negative records deep and lasting, but to do this we must give them a great deal of emotion and thought. If we simply refuse to vitalize these situations, they have a tendency to fade out and also to leave less scar tissue in our psychological nature. Consciously, therefore, we begin the process of determining the nature of things to be remembered or forgotten. We can remember by forcing a situation. A person wishing to remember the name of someone can do a great deal to ensure that this name is not forgotten. One of the common practices, for example, is to repeat the name a number of times. By this process, it becomes more deeply fixed in the memory. We also can make association relationships, which constitutes the principal secret of the so-called better memory systems. For these systems, we take a new name or a new personality and adjust it in some way to previously known or remembered names or personalities. Thus, we gain the assistance of an association, a recollection that causes us to remember one and become mindful of the other. Thus, we know that memory can be deepened by a definite determination to remember that particular subject. We also know, as René Descartes, the great French philosopher, pointed out, that once a memory has been established, it becomes stronger in our subconscious than in our conscious recollection. Consequently, when we are trying to think of someone's name, whose name we should remember, consciously we sometimes become confused. The harder we try to think, the more elusive that name becomes. And if we struggle with it hard enough and long enough, we never will remember it. On the other hand, under such conditions, if we will simply relax the mind totally, we will suddenly find that this name will appear within our memory. And it seems that the continuance of the surface stress has a tendency to deny the recollection that we most desire. These principles can be used in psychological conditioning today. And we fully recognize that much information and many thoughts that we have stored away, perhaps only under the immediate surface of our minds, can be quickly brought into focus by means of receptivity of attitude. Relaxation will bring these facts back to our conscious awareness. This is probably one of the reasons why most persons do not like to relax or are afraid to. The moment we cease the surface conflict of thinking, we have available to us this subsurface area of memories, remembrances, and associations. For most persons, these are not fortunate. They are not happy. And left to our own mental and emotional devices, we see or believe that it is more important to remain in a stimulated state in order to blot out that which comes to mind when we are not consciously controlling mental process. The answer, obviously, is that this load that we are carrying below the surface is therefore constantly present and insinuates itself not only into our relaxation, but to a measure into our active mental procedure. Once we have taken an attitude or decided something or become convinced of something, this attitude or conviction will certainly be present as an equation in every thought that we have. Certainly every thought which has any bearing upon a related subject. We may not always be consciously aware that we are thinking from personal prejudice, but if there is a prejudice, it will influence us. If there is a blind spot in our own thinking, This blind spot will mutilate practically any thought that we have. So we are not only in danger of this flood coming in upon us when we relax, it is also present in our conscious processes and will affect us whenever we permit ourselves a reflective or introspective mood. When we try to think things through, we will think them through according to the thoughts that we have available. And if these thoughts are not essentially good, our conclusions will not be essentially good. Now, it is not possible for the average person to live a life of activity without a certain number of unfortunate episodes occurring. The person is bound to be under some kind of stress sometime. Very often these stress patterns are rather frequent. Then perhaps there will be an interlude in which they will be less frequent. But certainly we cannot go through life without episodes occurring which are unpleasant or dangerous or disappointing or frustrating to us in one way or another. Our first problem is our attitude toward these as they occur. Very often we can rationalize a situation even while we are instinctively passing through unpleasantness. Perhaps we can suddenly, dominantly realize that the situation is of our own making, that somewhere in the pattern we have set the stage for this. Therefore, that we have no right to regard the incident as unreasonable or unfair. If we can take the unfairness out of a retention situation, we weaken its ability to hurt us later. If we can take the injustice out, if we can take the personal jealousies out, the self-pity out, even while we are recording the incident, what is left is essentially factual. And if we can supply this subconsciousness only with fact, we are usually in a safer situation. Facts are not dramatic. Very few people ever get worked up over a fact, even if it's an unpleasant fact. We say this is the way it is, and so we must accept it. Most of our serious retentions are not factual. They are highly glamorized interpretations of incidents, glamorized to serve some ulterior purpose in our own mental emotional processes. They support something we want to believe, but not necessarily anything factual. They help us to justify ourselves in a false situation where we should not be justified. But it is so pleasant to justify ourselves, even at the expense of facts, and very often at the expense of the rights of other people. So in the beginning, we can censor that which we retain. If we look back upon something that happened 10 or 15 years ago, and we can honestly and sincerely say to ourselves, this was a landmark of my own stupidity. Seldom did I do anything worse than the way I handled that situation. This type of situation, this type of reaction, is not inclined to or likely to create a psychosis. If, however, we have carefully worked this situation over with our imagination and our various personalized emotions and thoughts, so that we look back and we say, never have I suffered so without just cause as on that occasion. This attitude will give us that nice, warm, rosy glow that is associated with certain processes of disintegration. This type of thinking will ensure us that gradually our attitude toward the whole world, toward the universe, toward God and nature will be less honorable. And from this situation, we also have a wonderful springboard in which we can develop further self-pity. Because perhaps out of this very stupid thing that we did, a number of unpleasant circumstances arose. If we justify the original action, which should not have been justified, then we certainly are in a condition to suffer acutely from all the succeeding consequences. These consequences then become merely further punishment. We are not at fault in anything. And as soon as we reach that degree of mental astigmatism in which we are no longer at fault, a condition in which most other people are bad or wrong, but we are strangely and mystically right in everything. When we get to that position, we are heading into a very dangerous mental habit, one that will ultimately cause us misery, will lose us our friends, perhaps destroy our business and break up our home. After these consequences have set in, then we are ready for more self-pity, because we started with the wrong basic premise, and everything else became further justification for the fact that the world was against us. It is very important then, and this is one of the contributions that philosophy can make to the life of man, that whenever a situation that is obscure or mysterious and apparently hurtful arises in our affairs, we should sit down and think it through then and there. Because if we can think it through the first day, it will do us very little damage, providing we come up with some kind of an honorable or honest conclusion. Perhaps the second or third day will still be good time in which to work the problem out. But if we wait for 6 months or a year, or look back 10 years later, the damage is done. We have already twisted and distorted our thinking so long that it is probably impossible for us to arrive at any honest or honorable conclusion. If we believe in philosophy, particularly the great classical systems of the East and West, we must face the situation that philosophy teaches us that we live in an honest world, that the things that happen to us are the results of what we are, and that the so-called injuries that come to us from others depend upon ourselves for the degree of injury which they can cause. It is very unpleasant, perhaps, when someone else insults us. But this is not important. It is what we do about it that immediately sets up patterns. It is very important, therefore, how we react to the action of another person. Sometimes we can also be devastating as far as the other person is concerned. Someone will turn to us and say, well, you are the largest fool in 16 states. He's expecting a nice, happy fight, and has perhaps a desire to do all that he can to humiliate us or antagonize us. But if we turn to him and say with a real meaningful smile, I know it, now what do? He is entirely disarmed. There's not much left for him to do. And anyone who doesn't know that he's probably one of the largest fools in any 16 states, probably has overestimated himself to begin with. We are all foolish. Let us begin by realizing this. And if someone tells us, he's really doing us a favor. Now, we don't necessarily agree with him in all details. Perhaps we may think at the moment that he is much more wrong than we are. If we have any feelings about the matter, we certainly have a right to state our position. If he doesn't like that, he's in the same class that we are in. We didn't like what he said. That makes two people just alike. If, however, we have reason to believe he may be correct, then there is no use being proud. He has probably done us more good by pointing out our weakness than he could by agreeing with us in our mistake. The least we can say about his remark is that it's stimulating. And from that point on, we can investigate it. If he's right, we can tell him so sometime. If we do not think he is right, we can disprove him by our own conduct. Thus, we do not need to begin the process of building up a bitter antagonism over something of this nature. We do not need to begin to assume that this other person is an adversary who must be discomforted at all cost. And there is no reason why we should sit down and remember this episode for the rest of our days and list it among the precious beads on that little rosary of our discontent that we say several times a day. There is no need for this type of thinking. Also, there are episodes that arise in which perhaps the factors are more real or vital. One of our problems may be in life that we are naturally rather good-natured people. We like to try to help when we can. Very often our help is exploited. Very often when we are kind-hearted, we are simply interpreted as being weak. And when we try to be kind to people, they think we're afraid of them. Well, what they think isn't really very important. The question is, what were our motives? Were our own motives right? If our motives were right, the problem of the misinterpretation rests with the person who misinterprets, not with us. There is no reason why we can't like people for what they are, even while we have reservations about what they do. There is a great deal of difference in these points. Perhaps we would realize that if we were in their place, with the experiences that they have had, we might well then be as suspicious as they are. These values perhaps may seem to be evasional, but the truth of the situation is usually our charity is more honorable than our criticism. It is so very easy to condemn others. It is so very easy to read the worst into a situation. Yet in so doing, we are not fair and not reasonable. More important, we are doing ourselves an injustice. We are preparing the way to be less likable, less happy, less healthy individuals.